Nathaniel Whitmore was a man who had never known failure. From the outside, he seemed to have it all: wealth, power, and the kind of effortless charm that made people both admire and envy him. As the CEO of one of New York's most elite investment firms, he had built an empire with sharp instincts and a ruthless business approach. Winning was second nature to him, whether in business, negotiations, or personal conquests. He thrived in an environment where he was in complete control, where the world bent to his will. It was at an exclusive charity gala, held in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, that the challenge was thrown his way. The event was filled with New York's most influential people: business tycoons, celebrities, and high society figures clinking glasses of champagne and exchanging superficial pleasantries. Nathaniel moved through the crowd effortlessly, exuding confidence, flanked by men who respected him and women who desired him. Among his entourage was Julian Mercer, a longtime friend, but also a frequent rival. Julian was one of the few people who dared to challenge Nathaniel, often turning simple conversations into ego-driven competitions. It was during one of these conversations, over aged whiskey and an air of playful arrogance, that Julian smirked and leaned in. "You always win, Nathaniel," he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But I wonder, could you win at something that doesn't play by your usual rules?" Nathaniel arched a brow, intrigued but unimpressed. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Julian's smirk widened. "A bet. Something a little more personal." He glanced around the room before his eyes landed on someone across the hall. "I bet you wouldn't have the guts to marry a woman who doesn't fit your usual aesthetic." Nathaniel followed Julian's gaze, expecting to see some eccentric heiress or a socialite past her prime. Instead, his eyes landed on Charlotte Hayes. She was nothing like the women Nathaniel typically dated, women who were polished, statuesque, and perpetually camera-ready. Charlotte was curvier, with a quiet presence that contrasted with the extravagance around her. She wasn't adorned in designer labels or vying for attention like the others at the event. Instead, she seemed completely at ease, engaged in conversation with an elderly couple, her laughter genuine and uninhibited. Nathaniel's first instinct was to dismiss the idea, but Julian saw the hesitation and pressed further. "What's the matter? Afraid you can't charm her like all the others?" Nathaniel's ego flared. He had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. "And what's in it for me?" he asked, feigning indifference. Julian leaned back with an air of satisfaction. $1 million. But you have to stay married to her for 6 months. Nathaniel scoffed, though the offer intrigued him. $1 million was insignificant to a man of his wealth, but the thrill of competition, that was something he could never resist. Besides, this was just another game, another victory waiting to be claimed. He could charm anyone. Winning Charlotte over would be no different than any other conquest. "Fine," Nathaniel agreed smoothly, extending his hand. "You've got a deal." Julian shook his hand, his smirk never wavering. "Then may the best man win." Nathaniel wasn't concerned about the specifics. He had seduced and won over women far more complicated than Charlotte Hayes. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly anticipate, was that this wasn't going to be like any of his past victories. This time, he wasn't in control of the game. The next day, Nathaniel's assistant provided him with everything there was to know about Charlotte. She was a passionate advocate for community programs, working closely with underprivileged youth and promoting literacy initiatives. Unlike the women in Nathaniel's usual social circle, she had built her career on purpose rather than privilege. There was something undeniably intriguing about her. She wasn't after fame or fortune. She lived by a different set of values, and that in itself made her a challenge. Their first meeting was arranged at an upscale restaurant in the heart of the city. Nathaniel arrived first, as he always did, accustomed to making people wait. But when Charlotte walked in, she carried herself with an ease that was both unexpected and disarming. She wasn't intimidated by the lavish surroundings or by Nathaniel himself. She met his gaze with quiet confidence as she took a seat across from him. "You must be Nathaniel Whitmore," she said, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. "And you must be Charlotte Hayes." He extended his hand, expecting her to shake it. She hesitated for the briefest moment before taking it firmly, her grip surprising him. "Let's not waste time," she said, cutting straight to the point. "I know about the bet." Nathaniel masked his surprise well, but internally, he was caught off guard. He had expected a slower seduction, a gradual unfolding of charm and persuasion. Instead, Charlotte was standing at the starting line, already aware of the game. "And yet, you agreed to meet me," he noted, watching her carefully. "Why?" Charlotte held his gaze, unflinching. "Let's just say I have my reasons." There was no coyness in her demeanor, no pretense. Nathaniel had met countless people who concealed their motives behind layers of pretense, but Charlotte wasn't one of them. She was forthright, and it intrigued him. He expected resistance, but not the kind that came with quiet self-assurance. "If you think you can manipulate or control me, you're mistaken," she continued, her voice calm but firm. 6 months is 6 months, and I plan to walk away the same way I came in. Nathaniel studied her, his amusement growing. Charlotte Hayes was going to be more of a challenge than he had anticipated. And the thrill of the game had just begun. What Nathaniel didn't realize was that for the first time in his life, the rules had changed. Charlotte wasn't here to be won over, and that single truth would shift the entire course of his carefully calculated world. Nathaniel Whitmore was a man who had never known failure. From the outside, he seemed to have it all: wealth, power, and the kind of effortless charm that made people both admire and envy him. As the CEO of one of New York's most elite investment firms, he had built an empire with sharp instincts and a ruthless business approach. Winning was second nature to him, whether in business, negotiations, or personal conquests. He thrived in an environment where he was in complete control, where the world bent to his will. It was at an exclusive charity gala, held in a sprawling penthouse overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, that the challenge was thrown his way. The event was filled with New York's most influential people: business tycoons, celebrities, and high society figures clinking glasses of champagne and exchanging superficial pleasantries. Nathaniel moved through the crowd effortlessly, exuding confidence, flanked by men who respected him and women who desired him. Among his entourage was Julian Mercer, a longtime friend, but also a frequent rival. Julian was one of the few people who dared to challenge Nathaniel, often turning simple conversations into ego-driven competitions. It was during one of these conversations, over aged whiskey and an air of playful arrogance, that Julian smirked and leaned in. "You always win, Nathaniel," he mused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "But I wonder, could you win at something that doesn't play by your usual rules?" Nathaniel arched a brow, intrigued but unimpressed. "And what exactly are you proposing?" Julian's smirk widened. "A bet. Something a little more personal." He glanced around the room before his eyes landed on someone across the hall. "I bet you wouldn't have the guts to marry a woman who doesn't fit your usual aesthetic." Nathaniel followed Julian's gaze, expecting to see some eccentric heiress or a socialite past her prime. Instead, his eyes landed on Charlotte Hayes. She was nothing like the women Nathaniel typically dated, women who were polished, statuesque, and perpetually camera-ready. Charlotte was curvier, with a quiet presence that contrasted with the extravagance around her. She wasn't adorned in designer labels or vying for attention, like the others at the event. Instead, she seemed completely at ease, engaged in conversation with an elderly couple, her laughter genuine and uninhibited. Nathaniel's first instinct was to dismiss the idea, but Julian saw the hesitation and pressed further. "What's the matter? Afraid you can't charm her like all the others?" Nathaniel's ego flared. He had never backed down from a challenge, and he wasn't about to start now. "And what's in it for me?" he asked, feigning indifference. Julian leaned back with an air of satisfaction. $1 million. But you have to stay married to her for 6 months. Nathaniel scoffed, though the offer intrigued him. $1 million was insignificant to a man of his wealth, but the thrill of competition, that was something he could never resist. Besides, this was just another game, another victory waiting to be claimed. He could charm anyone. Winning Charlotte over would be no different than any other conquest. "Fine," Nathaniel agreed smoothly, extending his hand. "You've got a deal." Julian shook his hand, his smirk never wavering. "Then may the best man win." Nathaniel wasn't concerned about the specifics. He had seduced and won over women far more complicated than Charlotte Hayes. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly anticipate, was that this wasn't going to be like any of his past victories. This time, he wasn't in control of the game. The next day, Nathaniel's assistant provided him with everything there was to know about Charlotte. She was a passionate advocate for community programs, working closely with underprivileged youth and promoting literacy initiatives. Unlike the women in Nathaniel's usual social circle, she had built her career on purpose rather than privilege. There was something undeniably intriguing about her. She wasn't after fame or fortune. She lived by a different set of values, and that in itself made her a challenge. Their first meeting was arranged at an upscale restaurant in the heart of the city. Nathaniel arrived first, as he always did, accustomed to making people wait. But when Charlotte walked in, she carried herself with an ease that was both unexpected and disarming. She wasn't intimidated by the lavish surroundings or by Nathaniel himself. She met his gaze with quiet confidence as she took a seat across from him. "You must be Nathaniel Whitmore," she said, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. "And you must be Charlotte Hayes." He extended his hand, expecting her to shake it. She hesitated for the briefest moment before taking it firmly, her grip surprising him. "Let's not waste time," she said, cutting straight to the point. "I know about the bet." Miss Nathaniel masked his surprise well, but internally, he was caught off guard. He had expected a slower seduction, a gradual unfolding of charm and persuasion. Instead, Charlotte was standing at the starting line, already aware of the game. And yet, you agreed to meet me, he noted, watching her carefully. Why? Charlotte held his gaze, unflinching. Let's just say I have my reasons. There was no coyness in her demeanor, no pretense. Nathaniel had met countless people who concealed their motives behind layers of pretense, but Charlotte wasn't one of them. She was forthright, and it intrigued him. He expected resistance, but not the kind that came with quiet self-assurance. If you think you can manipulate or control me, you're mistaken, she continued, her voice calm but firm. 6 months is 6 months, and I plan to walk away the same way I came in. Nathaniel studied her, his amusement growing. Charlotte Hayes was going to be more of a challenge than he had anticipated, and the thrill of the game had just begun. What Nathaniel didn't realize was that for the first time in his life, the rules had changed. Charlotte wasn't here to be won over, and that single truth would shift the entire course of his carefully calculated world. Nathaniel had always thought of himself as someone who could predict every move in a game, every reaction in a negotiation, every outcome in a deal. But Charlotte was proving to be an anomaly, something he had never accounted for. Despite his best efforts to control the situation, to make her bend to his world, she remained unmoved, and that made her an enigma he couldn't ignore. The days following their marriage were a test of wills. Nathaniel, used to commanding attention and adoration, found himself faced with a woman who seemed entirely unaffected by his wealth and status. He had thought that offering her an extravagant lifestyle, a life filled with privilege and indulgence, would be enough to sway her, to make her soften. But Charlotte remained steadfast, untouched by the allure of his world. It wasn't rebellion or defiance. It was simply who she was. And that, more than anything, frustrated him. One evening, he returned to the penthouse after a long day, expecting to find her waiting, perhaps even curious about him, about his life. Instead, he found her sitting by the floor-to-ceiling windows, a book in hand, completely immersed in her own world. She didn't even look up when he entered. The usual greetings he received from women in his past, a warm smile, a flirtatious glance, a rush to engage, were absent. Instead, Charlotte turned a page, barely acknowledging his presence. He cleared his throat, trying to command her attention. "You've barely said a word to me in 3 days." She finally looked up, her expression calm, unreadable. "You've barely said a word to me either." The simplicity of her response caught him off guard. He expected defiance, maybe a sharp retort. But instead, she spoke as if stating a mere fact. It disarmed him in a way he wasn't prepared for. "I assumed you'd be adjusting," he said, stepping closer, watching her reaction. "It's a lot to take in." Charlotte closed her book with deliberate slowness and met his gaze. "I knew what I was agreeing to when I accepted this. I don't need time to adjust, Nathaniel. I just don't see the need for unnecessary conversation." It was like a challenge, but not one born of hostility. She simply didn't view him the way others did. She didn't fear him, didn't worship him, didn't try to please him. She was simply existing alongside him, and that, more than anything, unnerved him. "Unnecessary conversation?" he repeated, a small smirk playing on his lips. "Is that how you see this marriage?" She didn't flinch. "It's an arrangement, isn't it?" His smirk faltered slightly. He should have been pleased. This was exactly what he had wanted. A clean, efficient transaction. No mess, no emotions, just a straightforward agreement. And yet, hearing her say it so plainly, as if his presence, his world, his influence meant nothing, left an unexpected hollowness in his chest. Nathaniel had never been ignored before. He had never had to work for someone's attention. He wasn't sure if it was his ego or something else. But for the first time in years, he felt unsettled by another person. The following morning, he tested the waters further. Over breakfast, he observed her as she quietly ate, flipping through a magazine. He decided to disrupt her calm. "I've arranged for us to attend a gala this weekend." Charlotte looked up, setting her coffee cup down. "I won't be going." He raised an eyebrow. It wasn't a request. "And yet," she said, holding his gaze, "I'm still declining." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "You don't like social events?" "I don't like pretenses," she answered simply. "And I don't belong in your world, Nathaniel. We both know that." Her words stirred something inside him, something that felt dangerously close to irritation, but also curiosity. He had expected some resistance, yes, but not this quiet, unwavering strength. Most people were desperate to be part of his world. Yet, here she was, standing apart, unshaken by everything that should have dazzled her. He could have forced the issue, demanded her presence, played the role of the powerful husband who dictated the rules. But he realized something. Forcing her wouldn't be a victory. He didn't want submission. He wanted understanding. He wanted to know why she was so unyielding. The rest of the week passed with the same quiet tension between them, each testing the other's limits in subtle ways. Nathaniel, for the first time in his life, was learning what it felt like to be on the receiving end of indifference, and he found that it gnawed at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Then came a turning point. Late one evening, he found her in the kitchen, making tea. The sight of her in a simple, oversized sweater, her hair loosely tied up, caught him off guard. She looked nothing like the women he usually surrounded himself with. She was real, grounded, and for some reason, he found himself lingering in the doorway, watching her. "You're staring," she said, without looking up. He chuckled softly, stepping closer. "I don't think you've ever asked me a single personal question." She glanced at him, unimpressed. "Do you want me to?" Most people were eager to know everything about him, his businesses, his wealth, his past, but Charlotte wasn't one of them. And that, he realized, was what made her so different. He studied her carefully. "Don't you have any curiosity about the man you married?" She set her tea down and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Why should I? This marriage isn't real." The words stung more than they should have. He had always known this wasn't real, that this was a game, a challenge, a bet. And yet, standing there, facing her calm detachment, he found himself wanting to prove something to her. But what exactly, he wasn't sure. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized something that unsettled him more than anything else. He wanted her attention. Not because he needed to win, not because of the bet, but because, for the first time, someone had looked at him and seen nothing extraordinary, and he wanted to change that. Charlotte was proving to be a far greater challenge than he had ever anticipated, and now He wasn't sure if he wanted to win or if he simply wanted to understand why losing to her didn't feel like a loss at all. Nathaniel sat in his penthouse, staring out at the city lights. Yet for the first time, they brought him no satisfaction. The sprawling metropolis that once felt like an extension of his power now seemed distant, almost foreign. His mind was consumed by Charlotte. The bet had started as a game, another challenge for him to win. But something was shifting. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, and her defiance fascinated him in a way he hadn't expected. He prided himself on his ability to predict and control people, but Charlotte was a mystery he couldn't unravel. Their first few weeks of marriage had been a battle of wills. Nathaniel had expected her to be overwhelmed by the luxury he provided, to be charmed by his wealth and presence. Instead, she remained steadfast in her independence. Every time he attempted to impress her with lavish gifts, she rejected them with polite but firm refusals. The expensive wardrobe he had arranged for her remained untouched. The private chef's elaborate meals left half-eaten. She insisted on maintaining her own routine, refusing to let the opulence of his world dictate her life. It frustrated him. He was used to women bending to his will, used to them being eager to please him, to fall in love with the image of the man he presented to the world. Charlotte, however, wasn't fooled. She met his calculated charm with quiet indifference, as if she saw straight through the act and into the person beneath it. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. One evening, determined to assert control, Nathaniel arranged for a grand dinner at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. He instructed his assistant to make sure the press was discreetly notified. If Charlotte refused his wealth, then perhaps she would yield to social pressure. As they arrived, cameras flashed, and murmurs filled the air. Charlotte, in a simple but elegant dress she had chosen herself, remained composed, unfazed by the attention. During dinner, Nathaniel studied her carefully. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. When he reached for her hand across the table, she hesitated before allowing the briefest of touches. It was the first time she had let down any kind of barrier, and it sent an unexpected thrill through him. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she asked, a knowing smile playing on her lips. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Enjoying what?" "This game you're playing," she said, taking a sip of her wine. "You think if you put me in situations like this, I'll start to play the role you expect." The obedient wife, impressed by all of this. She gestured around the opulent setting, the guests sneaking glances in their direction, the subtle presence of photographers. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. She saw right through him. "And what if I said I simply wanted to spend an evening with my wife?" She tilted her head slightly, considering him. "Then I would say you don't know how to separate a bet from reality." The words struck something deep within him. He should have been annoyed, but instead, he felt an odd sense of admiration. How was it that she always managed to put him on edge, to make him question himself? He was the one supposed to be in control, yet here he was, feeling as if she was slowly unraveling the carefully built walls he had spent years constructing. After dinner, they walked back to the car in silence. The night air was crisp, the city alive with distant sounds of traffic and laughter. As they reached the car, Charlotte stopped. turning to face him. "Nathaniel, what happens after 6 months?" she asked. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "When this arrangement ends," she said softly, "when the bet is over, do you go back to your world and I go back to mine?" He hadn't considered it seriously until now. He had assumed that by the time 6 months had passed, she would either have fallen for him or walked away without a second thought. But as she looked up at him, her eyes searching for something, truth, perhaps, he found himself at a loss for words. "I suppose we'll cross that bridge when we get there," he said finally. Charlotte exhaled, as if she had expected that answer. "That's the problem with you, Nathaniel. You think you have all the time in the world to figure things out, but some things can't be decided at the last minute." With that, she turned and got into the car, leaving him standing there, feeling something dangerously close to regret. In the following days, he found himself thinking about her words more than he cared to admit. He tried to distract himself with work, with business meetings, with high-profile deals, but none of it gave him the satisfaction it once had. Charlotte had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, a question he didn't have an answer for. What did happen after 6 months? One night, as he returned home late, he found Charlotte sitting by the large window of their penthouse, a book in her lap. The city lights cast a warm glow around her, making her look almost ethereal. He paused in the doorway, watching her. "You're staring," she said, without looking up. Nathaniel chuckled, stepping further into the room. "Maybe I'm trying to figure you out." Charlotte closed her book and turned to him. "And have you?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No, and it's driving me insane." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Good. Maybe it's time someone challenged you." He sat down across from her, something inside him shifting. He had spent his whole life winning, controlling, making sure he was always the one dictating the terms. But Charlotte was teaching him something he had never learned before: the power of unpredictability, of letting go, of allowing someone else to hold the reins for once. And the strangest part? He wasn't sure he minded. Nathaniel had always believed that control was his greatest strength. He controlled his business, his image, and the people around him. He had built his empire on precision and discipline, and he carried those principles into every aspect of his life. Yet, for the first time, he found himself unable to control something, or rather, someone. Charlotte. Days turned into weeks, and their marriage, which had begun as a cold arrangement, became a battlefield of silent defiance and unspoken tension. Charlotte remained steadfast in her resolve, refusing to conform to the lavish lifestyle Nathaniel had expected her to embrace. She was polite, but distant, present, yet unreachable. No matter how much he tried to bend the situation to his will, she remained unyielding, a force he had not anticipated. Nathaniel observed her with growing frustration and fascination. She moved through his penthouse as if she were merely passing through, never quite settling in. She did not fawn over the luxury he had surrounded her with. The designer clothes he had delivered to her remained untouched in the walk-in closet. The expensive jewelry, meant to impress her, stayed in their velvet-lined boxes. She even refused the chauffeur-driven car he had arranged, opting instead to navigate the city on foot or by subway. He had thought wealth was the ultimate power. He had thought comfort and convenience would eventually wear her down. But Charlotte was different. She did not need what he had to offer, and that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit. One evening, as he returned home from a long day at work, he found her sitting in the library, curled up in a chair, with a book in her hands. The soft glow of the lamp beside her illuminated the delicate curve of her face, the determined set of her jaw. She was utterly absorbed in whatever she was reading, so much so that she didn't acknowledge his presence immediately. He cleared his throat. "You're always reading," he noted, stepping closer. "What's so fascinating?" Charlotte looked up, her eyes calm but sharp. "Stories about people who lost everything and rebuilt their lives. Stories about resilience." Nathaniel smirked. "A bit dramatic, don't you think? You're hardly someone who lost everything." She shut the book gently and met his gaze. "That's where you're wrong. I lost my father. I lost stability. I lost trust in people who see others as nothing more than obstacles or tools." Her voice was even, but there was a quiet strength beneath it that unnerved him. For the first time, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Guilt? Doubt? He dismissed it quickly, unwilling to let himself dwell on emotions he had spent a lifetime suppressing. That night, as he lay in bed, he found himself thinking about her words, about the unwavering way she had looked at him, unafraid. She did not see him as someone to admire or fear. She saw him as someone to challenge, and he wasn't sure if he resented her for it or if he admired her for it. The next morning, he decided to change tactics. If he could not sway her with wealth, perhaps he could break her routine. He arranged for the locks on the penthouse to be changed while she was out, ensuring that she would have to call him to be let back in. He wanted to force her to rely on him, to remind her that he was the one in control. But when Charlotte returned and found herself locked out, she did not panic. She did not call him. Instead, she sat on the steps of the building, pulled out a book, and waited. When Nathaniel finally returned, hours later, expecting to see frustration in her eyes, he found only quiet amusement. She stood up, dusting off her skirt. "Change the locks?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. He crossed his arms. "I was expecting you to call me. I don't play games I can't win." She replied simply, before stepping past him and walking inside. Something inside him twisted. She was not broken. She was not even angry. She was simply patient. And that patience was what unnerved him most of all. The days stretched on, and Nathaniel found himself watching her more closely. He noticed the way she interacted with people, the kindness she extended to the staff, the way she never allowed herself to be treated as less than equal. She was, in many ways, the opposite of what he had expected. And the more he saw, the less sure he became of his own assumptions. One evening, they found themselves on the balcony together, looking out over the city. The air between them was thick with something unspoken. "You think I'm trying to win," she finally said, breaking the silence. He turned to her. "Aren't you?" She gave him a small, knowing smile. "No, Nathaniel, I'm just not losing." Her words stayed with him long after she had gone to bed. He had entered this arrangement believing that he would be the one shaping the game, controlling the outcome. But Charlotte was not playing by his rules. She was not playing at all. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel wondered if, perhaps, he was the one who had been outmatched from the very beginning. The days following Charlotte's bold declaration passed in a haze of tension and unspoken words. Nathaniel, a man accustomed to control, found himself grappling with a sensation he had never fully confronted before: uncertainty. He had built his empire on calculated risks and absolute dominance, but here, in the confines of his penthouse, he was powerless. Charlotte had flipped the dynamic, and he was no longer sure who was playing whom. Charlotte remained composed, as if she had anticipated every move Nathaniel would make. She navigated their shared space with an air of quiet defiance, neither seeking confrontation nor shying away from it. He watched her, studied her, searched for cracks in the armor she had so carefully crafted, but she remained steadfast. Her resilience fascinated him, frustrated him, and in a way he would never admit, unsettled him. One evening, as the city lights cast their glow against the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows, Nathaniel sat with a glass of whiskey in his hand, contemplating the enigma that was Charlotte. She was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. Most people he met were easy to decipher, driven by money, ambition, or power. But Charlotte? She had walked into his world with nothing but her strength and a quiet certainty that she would not be consumed by him. His thoughts were interrupted when she walked into the room, her presence commanding despite the simplicity of her attire. She wore a loose sweater and leggings, comfort clothes that contrasted starkly with the luxurious setting. She met his gaze, unwavering, before moving past him to the bookshelves. She traced her fingers along the spines of the books, pausing occasionally as if contemplating which world she wished to escape into for the night. "Do you always watch people like this?" she asked, without turning to face him. Nathaniel smirked, taking a slow sip of his drink. "Only when they're interesting." Charlotte hummed in response, finally selecting a book and turning to face him. "And what have you deduced about me?" "That you don't scare easily," he admitted. "That you're calculated. That you enjoy making me uncomfortable." She arched a brow, settling into the chair opposite him. Is that so? And here I thought I was just existing." He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Charlotte. You're far too deliberate for that." Silence stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. It was the closest they had come to acknowledging the shift between them, that this was no longer just a contract, no longer just a game. Something was happening, something neither of them fully understood, and it terrified them both in different ways. Nathaniel leaned forward, setting his glass down. "Why did you agree to this?" She exhaled slowly, as if she had been waiting for this question. "Because I saw an opportunity." "For what?" "For you to finally see beyond yourself," she said simply. "For you to realize that control isn't everything." He frowned, her words striking something deep within him. "You think I don't see beyond myself?" "I think you see what you want to see," she countered. "You believe you control the world around you, but you don't. You manipulate. You bend people to your will. But true control, that's an illusion." Nathaniel studied her, the weight of her words pressing against the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure how to respond. Charlotte rose from her seat, book in hand, and turned toward the hallway. Before disappearing into her room, she paused. "Good night, Nathaniel." He remained where he was, watching the space she had occupied, his mind swirling with thoughts he didn't know how to process. Charlotte was right, about more than he cared to admit, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he was the one leading this game anymore. The following days were a dance neither of them fully understood. Nathaniel found himself drawn to Charlotte in a way that went beyond the confines of their agreement. He observed her not as an opponent, but as a person. He noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought, the way she hummed softly when she cooked, the way she carried herself with quiet confidence despite everything. One evening, he found her on the balcony, wrapped in a blanket, as she gazed at the city below. He hesitated before stepping outside, the cool breeze biting against his skin. He handed her a cup of tea without a word, mirroring a gesture she had made for him days prior. She accepted it, their fingers brushing briefly, sending an unexpected jolt through him. They stood in silence, the city stretching before them, a living, breathing entity that neither of them controlled. And in that moment, Nathaniel realized something profound. He didn't want to control Charlotte. He wanted to understand her, and perhaps, just perhaps, he wanted to be understood in return. Charlotte turned to him then, her expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" He met her gaze, his voice softer than he intended. "Because I think you're right." A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Surprise, perhaps? Or maybe something else entirely. And for the first time since this all began, Nathaniel Marshall felt truly vulnerable. Neither of them spoke again that night, but as they stood together beneath the vast expanse of the night sky, something shifted. The lines between them blurred, and for the first time, it was no longer about winning or losing. It was about something far greater. The days following Charlotte's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Nathaniel. He was no longer the confident, untouchable man who believed he had control over everything. The weight of his past actions pressed down on him, suffocating in ways he had never imagined. He replayed her words over and over in his mind, the pain, the betrayal, the truth he had never cared to see. Charlotte had been playing the long game, not as a pawn, but as the architect of her own revenge, and he had walked straight into it. Despite the emotional turmoil that gripped him, Nathaniel couldn't bring himself to hate her. If anything, he admired her resilience, her unyielding spirit, and her ability to stand tall even when everything had been taken from her. He had spent his life manipulating others, bending circumstances to his will. But now, for the first time, he was the one left powerless. Charlotte, on the other hand, carried herself with quiet strength. She continued her routine as though nothing had happened, her presence in the house a constant reminder of the storm she had unleashed. She moved through the penthouse with purpose, neither avoiding nor engaging him more than necessary. She spoke only when needed, her words precise and detached. The warmth she had once shown, even in their most antagonistic moments, was gone. And that, more than anything, was what Nathaniel couldn't bear. One evening, he found her on the balcony, staring out at the city. The golden glow of the skyline reflected in her eyes, but her expression was unreadable. For a long moment, he simply stood there, watching her, before finally gathering the courage to step forward. "Charlotte," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, She didn't turn around. "What is it, Nathaniel?" He exhaled, gripping the railing. "I need to know. Was any of it real? Or was I just a means to an end?" At this, she finally turned to face him, her gaze sharp, yet not unkind. "Does it matter?" she asked softly. "Would it change anything?" His jaw tightened. "It matters to me." Charlotte studied him for a moment, and something flickered in her expression, an emotion he couldn't quite decipher. "I don't know," she admitted. "At first, you were nothing more than a symbol of everything I lost. But somewhere along the way, it became more complicated than that." Nathaniel swallowed hard. "Then why won't you let me fix this?" Charlotte let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "You can't fix what's already broken, Nathaniel. You can't undo the past." "I know," he said, his voice thick with regret. "But I can try to make things right." She shook her head. "You think redemption is something you can buy, something you can achieve through grand gestures. But it's not about that. It's about truly understanding what you've done and living with it." The truth in her words cut deep, but Nathaniel didn't retreat. Instead, he nodded slowly. "Then I'll prove it to you. Not with words, not with money, but with my actions." Charlotte searched his face for a moment, then turned back to the city. "We'll see," she murmured. "We'll see if you can." From that night on, Nathaniel made a silent vow. He would not seek forgiveness through empty apologies or extravagant attempts to win her over. Instead, he would change. He would face the consequences of his past and do what he should have done long ago. Take responsibility. He began by looking into the businesses he had ruined, the lives he had upended in his relentless pursuit of success. It was painful, humbling, and at times unbearable to see the faces of those who had suffered because of him. He reached out to families who had been displaced, to former employees who had been cast aside without a second thought. He listened to their stories, acknowledged their pain, and began taking real steps toward restitution. Not for his image, not to impress Charlotte, but because he needed to, because it was the right thing to do. Charlotte, ever watchful, observed his actions from a distance. She didn't offer words of encouragement nor condemnation. She simply watched. Nathaniel didn't expect anything from her. No praise, no sudden change of heart. But he hoped, in time, she would see that he was not the same man he had been when this all began. As the weeks passed, the dynamic between them began to shift. Charlotte was still guarded, still wary, but there was a softness returning to her demeanor. She allowed small conversations, moments of shared silence that no longer felt so suffocating. And then, one evening, she surprised him. "I heard about the fund you started," she said, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table. The first time in weeks they had shared a meal in anything other than silence. Nathaniel looked up, setting his fork down. "It's not enough," he admitted, "but it's a start." Charlotte nodded slowly. "Yes, it is." There was no sudden reconciliation, no grand moment of absolution. But for Nathaniel, that small acknowledgement meant everything. It was a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, there was still hope. Nathaniel stood in the middle of the grand penthouse, feeling like the walls were closing in on him. The city skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the vast expanse of New York stretching endlessly. Yet for the first time in his life, His world felt unbearably small. The luxury, the wealth, the power, none of it mattered anymore. He had built his empire on control, on winning, on ensuring that everything bent to his will. But Charlotte was the one thing that refused to break. And in that resistance, she had shattered the illusion he had clung to for so long. Days had passed since Charlotte's revelation about her father, about the pain he had caused her family. Nathaniel had thought he understood guilt before, but nothing had prepared him for the suffocating weight of true remorse. He had spent sleepless nights retracing every decision, every ruthless deal that had contributed to the downfall of lives he had never cared to see. Charlotte was the embodiment of the destruction he had left in his wake, a living, breathing reminder of the consequences he had never been forced to face. Yet, despite her pain, despite the hurt he had inflicted upon her, Charlotte had not sought to destroy him outright. She had the power to do so, She had maneuvered him into a position of vulnerability, orchestrating her revenge with precision, but she had not crushed him. Instead, she had left him with something far worse: self-awareness, a reckoning. And now, he was standing on the edge of something he couldn't define. He no longer knew if he was trying to win Charlotte back or simply trying to prove that he could be someone worthy of her forgiveness. Charlotte, meanwhile, remained distant. She did not scream. She did not fight. She simply withdrew, her silence more deafening than any confrontation could have been. It was in the quiet moments when she would sit on the balcony wrapped in a blanket, gazing at the city lights, that Nathaniel felt the full weight of his failure. She had once looked at him with curiosity, with intrigue, with reluctant amusement at his arrogance. Now, she looked through him, as if he were merely a ghost in the home they shared. He couldn't take it anymore. That night, he decided to lay everything bare. If she walked away, if she decided he was beyond redemption, then so be it. But he would not let this silence be the final word between them. He found her on the balcony again, the cool breeze making her hair dance around her face. She didn't turn when he stepped outside, but he knew she was aware of his presence. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "I need you to know that I regret everything." His voice was hoarse, the weight of his emotions pressing against his throat. "Not just what I did to your father, not just what I did to you, but the kind of man I was. The kind of man who never stopped to consider the lives he was destroying in pursuit of success." Charlotte didn't respond immediately. She continued looking out at the skyline, as if searching for something beyond the horizon. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Regret is easy, Nathaniel," she said quietly. "Anyone can feel sorry when they're forced to face the consequences. But regret doesn't undo what's been done." "I know that," he admitted, "and I know that I have no right to ask anything of you. But I need you to understand that I want to be better. Not just for you, not just to fix what's broken between us, but because I can't live with the man I was." Charlotte finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "You think you can change?" "I have to," he said, the conviction in his voice surprising even himself. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect us to go back to whatever this was supposed to be. But I need to start making things right, even if it's too late." She studied him for a long time, her sharp eyes searching for any sign of deception. He had spent his life manipulating people, twisting words to serve his own agenda. But for once, he had nothing to gain from lying. She must have seen that, because her gaze softened just the slightest bit. "Then prove it," she said simply. "Not to me. To yourself." Nathaniel nodded, knowing that words would never be enough. Actions, real, tangible change, were the only currency that held any value now. And so, in the days that followed, he set out to do just that. He reached out to the families of those he had wronged, offering financial reparations. Yes, but more than that, offering time, effort, and genuine accountability. He reopened businesses that had been shut down under his reign, giving people back the livelihoods he had stolen from them. He cut ties with the toxic influences in his life, stepping away from the ruthless, cutthroat world that had once defined him. Charlotte watched from a distance, cautious but intrigued. She had expected empty gestures, grand displays meant to impress rather than atone. But what she saw instead was different. She saw a man stripped of his ego, a man grappling with his past in a way that was raw and real. And though she wasn't ready to let him back into her heart, she found herself, against her better judgment, beginning to hope. The night he came home exhausted, his sleeves rolled up, a streak of dust on his shirt from working at one of the reopened businesses, she finally let down her guard. Just a little. She poured him a cup of tea without a word, placing it on the table before returning to her seat. It was the smallest of gestures, but to Nathaniel, it felt like a lifeline. He took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest moment, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption was within reach. Alone in his study, the weight of Charlotte's revelation pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. The once grand and luxurious space, filled with leather-bound books and an air of dominance, now felt suffocating. He had spent years believing he was in control of his own destiny, that power and wealth dictated the course of his life. But Charlotte had shattered that illusion, revealing that he had been nothing more than a puppet of his own arrogance. Her words haunted him, echoing in the silence of the grand estate. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel felt small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. He thought back to the night of the bet, the laughter, the smug confidence in his voice when he agreed to marry a woman he had never met for the sake of proving a point. What a fool he had been. He had believed himself untouchable, certain that Charlotte would be like all the others, eager to please, desperate for his approval, malleable in his hands. Instead, she had become his greatest adversary, his greatest lesson. As the days passed, he found himself watching her more intently. She moved through the house with a quiet strength, her presence commanding, yet never overbearing. She did not revel in his downfall, nor did she celebrate the suffering she had inflicted upon him. Instead, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had endured great pain and had chosen to rise above it. Her resilience fascinated him, and for the first time, he truly wanted to understand her. One evening, as she stood by the window gazing out at the city skyline, he gathered the courage to approach her. "Charlotte," he said hesitantly. She turned, her expression unreadable. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even deserve it. But I need to know, was there ever a moment where you thought this could be real? That despite everything, we could be something more? Charlotte studied him, her sharp gaze searching his for deception. But there was none. The man before her was not the same arrogant tycoon who had laughed at the idea of marrying a woman outside his world. He was broken, stripped of his false confidence, standing before her not as a conqueror, but as a man desperate for answers. She sighed, crossing her arms. I don't know, Nathaniel. There were moments when I thought, maybe. But then I would remember who you were and what you had done. I couldn't afford to be foolish. Not again. Her honesty cut deeper than any of her calculated acts of revenge. He nodded, accepting her words. And now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Charlotte looked away, her expression conflicted. Now, I see someone trying to change. But change isn't enough, Nathaniel. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't bring back what was lost. He swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding. You're right. It doesn't. But it's all I can offer. Over the next few weeks, Nathaniel dedicated himself to more than just empty gestures. He sought to make real amends, not just to Charlotte, but to those he had wronged in the past. He restructured his company, ensuring ethical business practices that supported rather than destroyed smaller enterprises. He met with families whose lives he had devastated, not just offering them financial reparations, but listening to their stories, understanding the depth of his actions. And through it all, Charlotte watched, wary but intrigued. The 6-month contract was nearing its end, and with each passing day, Nathaniel found himself dreading the inevitable goodbye. He had come to realize that his feelings for Charlotte were no longer about a bet or proving something to himself. He had fallen in love with her strength, her intelligence, her ability to stand against him when no one else had. But love alone was not enough to erase the pain he had caused. On the last night of their contract, he prepared a dinner for her, a simple yet heartfelt gesture. She arrived at the table, her guard still partially up, but there was a softness in her eyes that had not been there before. They ate in silence for a while before Nathaniel finally spoke. Charlotte, I know our arrangement ends tomorrow, and if you choose to walk away, I will respect that. But I need you to know that this was never just a game to me. Not anymore. You changed me in ways I never expected, and for that, I owe you everything. Charlotte placed her fork down, folding her hands on the table. Nathaniel, I don't doubt that you've changed, but change isn't just about words or actions over a few months. It's about who you are when no one is watching, about the choices you make when you think they don't matter. If you truly want to be different, then prove it. To yourself, not to me. His heart clenched at her words. He had hoped for something more, a sign that she would stay, that she could find it in her heart to love him. But he also knew that love was not something to be won like a business deal. It was something to be earned, nurtured over time. The next morning, Charlotte packed her things, and Nathaniel stood at the doorway watching her. She turned to him one last time, giving him a small but genuine smile. Goodbye, Nathaniel. And then she was gone. Nathaniel spent the following months continuing the path he had started, not for Charlotte, but for himself. He became a man of integrity, rebuilding not just his company, but his own character. He no longer sought control over people, but instead sought to uplift them. And though he missed Charlotte every day, he knew that what they had was never meant to be easy. Then, one evening, as he was leaving his office, he saw her standing by the entrance, watching him with an unreadable expression. His heart stopped. "Charlotte." She took a deep breath, stepping closer. "I've been watching, and you were right. Change doesn't erase the past, but it does shape the future." Hope flickered in his chest. "Does this mean—" She nodded, a small smile forming. "It means I'm willing to see where this goes. But no bets, no contracts, just us." For the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt truly free. He took her hand, holding it gently, knowing that this was just the beginning of something real. Nathaniel and Charlotte's journey began as a game, a reckless bet fueled by arrogance and pride. Nathaniel, a man accustomed to winning in business and controlling everything around him, saw people as pieces in a grand game of power. Charlotte, on the other hand, was a woman of resilience and strength, someone who had endured struggles far greater than Nathaniel could ever comprehend. Their marriage, originally nothing more than a transaction, became an unexpected battlefield of wills, emotions, and ultimately transformation. At first, Nathaniel sought to conquer Charlotte the way he had conquered every challenge in his life, through wealth, manipulation, and control. But Charlotte was unlike anyone he had ever met. She refused to be molded by him, refused to bend to his wealth, and most of all, refused to let him dictate her worth. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel faced resistance he couldn't overpower. Charlotte's unwavering independence, her refusal to be impressed by material luxuries, and her raw honesty shook the very foundation of his ego. As time passed, what was once a power struggle evolved into something far more profound. Charlotte's presence forced Nathaniel to confront his own emptiness, the hollowness of a life built on money and control. She challenged him, not with anger or hatred, but with dignity and self-respect. And in that challenge, Nathaniel found himself questioning everything: his past, his values, and the very person he had become. The true turning point came when Charlotte revealed the devastating truth. Nathaniel had unknowingly destroyed her family. The ruthless business tactics he had used to build his empire had cost her father his livelihood and ultimately his life. This revelation shattered Nathaniel's perception of himself. For years, he had seen his success as proof of his superiority, but now he saw the painful reality. His victories had left behind a trail of broken lives, and one of those lives was the woman standing before him. Determined to change, Nathaniel set out on a path of redemption, not with empty words or grand gestures, but through action. He worked to right the wrongs he had caused, seeking out those he had harmed, making amends, and proving through his deeds that he was no longer the same man. And in this journey, something unexpected happened. Charlotte, the woman who had once despised him, began to see the sincerity in his transformation. Their love story was not one of fairy tales or sudden forgiveness. It was built on hardship, redemption, and the slow, painful process of growth. It was proof that people can change, that redemption is possible, but only if it is truly earned. In the end, Nathaniel and Charlotte chose to walk forward together, not as enemies bound by a bet, but as two people who had learned to see each other beyond the mistakes of the past. The lesson from their story is clear. True worth is not measured by wealth or power, but by the capacity to grow, to take responsibility, and to change for the better. Oh yeah. No matter how far we've strayed, no matter the mistakes we've made, there is always a path back if we are willing to walk it with humility and sincerity. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support inspires us to bring more powerful, meaningful stories to life. Stay with us for more narratives that touch the heart, challenge the mind, and remind us of what truly matters.